I am pleased to turn the podium over to Laure Murat, Professor of French and Francophone Studies at UCLA.
Good evening and welcome at the Getty. When a few weeks ago I told a UCLA colleague and still a friend that I was preparing the lecture, he immediately replied to me, "Hold on, you, a French professor and a French professor of French literature and French cultural history, giving a lecture entitled Swan Song on a British painter with German music on Fool's Day? That sounds to me like the perfect hoax. Nobody will show up." So I'm glad to see that this very funny prophecy turned to be eventually quite wrong. In other words, thank you very much for your presence tonight and for your exquisite sense of humor. When Guillaume Sutre and I created Sonnets and Sonatas 2 years ago, our goal was not necessarily to promote French culture. Promoting French culture was only the insidious intention. Our goal was and remains first to show that arts are not isolated and that they are working in conjunction with each other. And second, to bridge the gap between the university that can be sometimes a little bit too isolated to a wider audience. In sum, what we would like is to put into dialogue arts, disciplines, and people. It's ambitious, but it works. The Getty Center is, of course, the ideal place for such an agenda, and I'm very grateful to Timothy Potts, the Getty Museum director, to welcome us tonight. I would also like to thank Peter Tarkowski, who is the mainspring of this evening, Julian Brooks and Peter Kerber, co-curators of the exhibition, Daniel Alvarez in Events Department, David Singelman in Groups Department, and the Getty Audiovisual team, who are doing such an amazing job. Last piece of information, if some of you are interested in Sonnets and Sonatas future events, you'll find a sign-up sheet at the exit of the auditorium at the end of the show. Now, let's get to the heart of the matter. As far as we go back in time, the story of the Swan Song, this last and beautiful dirge performed by usually mute swans before dying, remains a striking and popular image. Aesop, Aristotle, Ovid, Virgil evoked it, not to mention Plato's Phaedo, where Socrates, in his cell, meditating on suicide, compares his speech to a swan song. No matter that, as early as 77 Common Era, Pliny the Elder confirmed in his Natural History that swans are not mute during life and that they don't sing before dying. The fable, as all the fables, is false, but the myth, as all myths, endures. As time goes by, the myth became a commonplace, drawing scholars' attention to artists' late work. But is the idea of late work meaningful, since the artist, as any human being, doesn't know the date of his or her death? How to determine the moment when late work begins, at least we know when it ends, and how to justify its consistency. In Turner's case, the curators of the exhibition chose a rather long scope, from 1835, when the painter turned 60, to 1850, when he presented his work for the last time at the Royal Academy in London, 1 year before his death. Why this period? A birthday and an official exhibition date can be handy reference points, but that is not the point. From 1835 until his death, Turner turned more and more abstract, if I may use such an anachronism, in his foggy, hazy, apparently vague landscapes. In other words, it is not chronology that decides late work, but a supposedly late style that would determine chronology. Nevertheless, in this necessarily a posteriori reasoning, or rather retrospective illusion, is a concept such as late style really relevant? As the subtitle of the exhibition, Painting Set Free, seems to suggest, the answer is yes. Towards the end of a career or a life, which is usually the same for a creator, the artist would push all the boundaries. His subjectivity would overcome all the conventions. There would be some kind of an aesthetic release, a liberation of the mind. A good picture is worth 1,000 words, Napoleon used to say. That's the insidious way I have to promote the French culture. Let's have a look at Turner's so-called late work to attempt to define a hypothetic late style, if there is such. In order to be more efficient, I selected a series of paintings dating from the 1840s, exactly the period in the exhibition, sometimes compared to earlier work in order to understand Turner's evolution and shift. Let's take Norham Castle, for instance. Painted at 46 years of distance in 1799 and in 1845. On top is a pastoral view of a charming landscape on the border between England and Scotland. Below is an early Impressionist painting about nature and light. On top is a depiction. Below is a perception. The comparison speaks for itself, as it illustrates the passage from an objective and narrative vision of the 18th century to the subjective, internalized conception of the 19th century. Let's take another example, such as A Snowstorm, the same title for two completely different topics. Snowstorm, Hannibal and his army crossing the Alps, painted in 1812, and Snowstorm, Steamboat off a harbor's mouth, painted in 1842. Ancient history through Hannibal's exploits, and anonymous and technical modernity through the steamboat, are treated alike in relation with the elements' outbursts. Who would say that 30 years separate these two paintings, which capture, in different ways, but with an identical vigor, the notion of the sublime, that is to say, horror and greatness together? Turning more abstract or impressionist, long before the terms were coined, doesn't mean Turner neglected figurative scenes, nor that he progressively set aside conventional representation. His approach to Venice is seen more and more out of focus as the boats and the city recede into the distance, was painted in 1845 when his Venice with the Salute, a virtually pale blue monochrome, is dated 1840, 5 years earlier. It remains true, nevertheless, that Turner painted some of his more enigmatic masterpieces in his last years, like Shade and Darkness and Light and Color, Landscape with River and Distant Mountains, or the very famous Sunrise with Sea Monsters, a posthumous title given by the National Gallery curators who had stumbled across unfinished canvases in a basement in 1906. The supposed incompleteness of many paintings found in Turner's house after his death — I remind you that Turner gave the entire contents of his studio to the British nation — makes, of course, more complicated and tricky our interpretation. Finished, unfinished, precursory, or simply tuned to the modernity of its time, Turner's late work, in any case, stands out dramatically when compared to contemporary creation of the mid-century in Great Britain and in Europe, whether to landscape paintings of his rival Constable, official and fashionable court portraiture of Winterhalter, or even avant-garde art such as Gustave Courbet's work. The remarkable example of Turner demonstrates how difficult it is to define any kind of late style, and not only in visual arts. Whether true, false, accurate, or deceptive, the idea of a swan song is, not surprisingly, often associated with music. In Shakespeare, The Merchant of Venice, Portia exclaims, "Let music sound with he doth make his choice. Then if he lose, he makes a swan-like end, fading in music." Swan song, or in German, Schwanengesang, is mostly among music lovers known to be the last song cycle composed by Franz Schubert. In the final year of his very short life, a period during which he wrote notably The Winter Journey, the Impromptus for piano, the Mass in E-flat major, several religious hymns and cantatas, the 3 final piano sonatas, the Symphony No. 9, the Trio in E-flat major, the String Quintet in C major, among other masterpieces. For Benjamin Britten, this period between October 1827 and November 1828 was nothing less, I quote, "the most miraculous year in the history of music." I agree with Benjamin Britten. Even though the title Swan Song was given posthumously by his publisher, it is often considered as Schubert's testament. We are very fortunate to have tonight with us 2 very talented artists, pianist Stephen Van Howard and tenor Nathan Granner, who are going to perform one of the most overwhelming songs of the cycle, entitled Serenade. Written in the same period as the Swan Song, the string quintet in C major was completed 2 months before Schubert's death at age 31, officially from typhoid fever, but more probably from syphilis and mercury poisoning, mercury being the common treatment against syphilis. In a considerable body of work in chamber music written by Schubert, it is his only full-fledged quintet, and a special one, given that he chose an unusual instrumentation, adding a second cello instead of a second viola to augment the traditional quartet. Schubert had just enough time to propose it to one of his publishers, but the piece was dismissed and neglected for a very long time, which is hard to believe, but once published 25 years later, it became more and more admired around the world, to such an extent that it is today considered as one of the highest points in the entire chamber repertoire. It inspired Brahms' piano quintet in 1865. Both Thomas Mann's and Arthur Rubinstein's wish was to hear the second movement on their deathbed. It is precisely this very poignant adagio, the entrance to heaven, according to Rubinstein, that we're going to listen now. If you're not crying, I mean, I resign. And I'm looking especially at my students. If you're not crying, tomorrow you'll get an F. That is called French grading. A bit old-fashioned, but efficient. I would like to take this opportunity to pay a tribute to my dear friend and partner in crime, Guillaume Sutre at the viola, who works tirelessly for this series, and Guillaume, as a professor of violin, who also plays viola, and director of string chamber music at UCLA, trained all these very young and talented people. Ambroise Aubrin, first violin. Eriko Tsuji, second violin. Hilary Smith, first cello. Christopher Ahn, second cello. As heartrending as they are, do the Swan Song and the String Quintet, only examples among others in the miraculous final year, prove any relevant late style in Schubert's work? Is the final year 1827-1828 an accurate reference point, or should we go back to November 1822, the moment when Schubert was diagnosed with syphilis, a kind of a death sentence at the time? For the great pianist Paul Lewis, who is recording Schubert's complete works for piano, a dramatic change can be observed in the scores from the diagnosis to the death, a period he even calls the syphilitic years. According to the interpreter, I quote, "There is some kind of an acceptance of his fate," end of quote. A statement substantiated by some musicologists and other great interpreters like Alfred Brendel, who significantly released in 2011 a box set of 7 discs on Schubert's work from 1822 to 1828. But late period doesn't correspond necessarily to late style. As Brendel puts it, I quote, "Mozart lived his life and arrived at a kind of late style. Schubert, on the contrary, was in the middle of a tremendous development when he died." Instead of embodying any late style, Schubert's last year should therefore be considered as both the epitome and the climax of his too short life and career. And if any additional argument was needed to explain such grand finale's brilliance and freedom in scope, I would prefer to evoke an event probably even more decisive than illness or premonition of the end, that is, Beethoven's death on March 26, 1827. Although the two composers lived in Vienna at the same time, there is little evidence that they met more than once, an encounter that turned into disappointment because of Schubert's great shyness. However, musicologists have traced for a very long time the multiple tributes Schubert paid to Beethoven's genius through references and quotations in his own music. Our 2 examples are marked by Beethoven's presence. The serenade lyrics, written by poet Ludwig Rellstab, were sent to Beethoven but actually given by his private secretary to Schubert, considered as the only musician able to take over. His string quintet is very likely an homage to Beethoven's string quintet Opus 29, also in C major, which is, interestingly enough, the last piece Beethoven wrote and that remained unfinished. 27 years Beethoven's junior, Schubert only survived him by 20 months, as we know, his most prolific period. Did Schubert feel liberated by the fall of the statue of the Commendatore? It is noteworthy that his most successful concert was the one he gave for the anniversary of Beethoven's death in March 1828. It is also significant that if Schubert relates to Beethoven, he hardly follows him, an independence that prompted Arnold Schoenberg to point out how amazing it was that Schubert, in the shadow of what he called a crushing figure like Beethoven, developed his own individual style. Schubert was one of the torchbearers at Beethoven's funeral, asked to be buried next to him. 3 days before his death, he asked for a last favor, to listen to Beethoven String Quartet No. 14, Opus 131, whose final allegro is going to be performed now. In other words, what you are going to hear is one of Beethoven's last pieces, which is at the same time the last music Schubert listened to. Article on late style in Beethoven, included in his Essays on Music, philosopher Theodor Adorno explains that late style only emerges in the formal law constituted by the relationship between conventions and subjectivity revealed in the thought of death. Refusing any psychological explanation, Adorno focuses on the aesthetic disruption revealed in late style. His conclusion is unexpected. the power of subjectivity disengages itself to set free the work of art as a mere appearance, a monument. The caesuras, writes Adorno, the sudden discontinuities that more than anything else characterize the very late Beethoven are those moments of breaking away that have been so disturbing for the audience, including after the death of Beethoven. In the history of art, Adorno concludes in a very Hegelian tradition, late works are the catastrophes. Catastrophes in the sense of lost totality. But what does work for Beethoven doesn't necessarily apply to other musicians, except, according to Adorno himself, Gustav Mahler. Similarly, what is true for Turner, that is to say, the disruption he created in his late work, accurately defined as painting set free in the exhibition, can be wrong for, let's say, Auguste Renoir, whose late period, filled with, I quote, enormously fat women with very small heads, as Mary Cassatt put it, has been widely considered as reactionary while Cubism was reinventing the world. An old master is not necessarily a prophet. In 1846, at age 36, Frédéric Chopin was not an old master, but he had already paved the way for the composers of the second half of the century. His new style, better than late one, of the post-romantic period, characterized by an increased chromaticization of the melodic line and more complex textures, culminates with his cello sonata in G minor. This masterpiece, the result of difficult decisions and arduous labor, as the 200 pages of sketches demonstrate, took him 18 months to complete. The first public performance in Paris on February 16, 1848, featuring the composer himself at the piano and the dedicatee of the sonata, Auguste Franchomme, at the cello, will be Chopin's last concert. A few months later, in a final patriotic gesture, he found the energy to play the last time for the benefit of Polish refugees in London. He'll die in the fall of 1849 from tuberculosis in Paris. In homage to Chopin's new and last style, Stephen Van Howard and Hilary Smith are going to play the third movement of the cello sonata. first time Chopin met Georges Sand in 1836, his first reaction was that of a man towards an independent French woman who writes and smokes cigars. Something about her repels me, he confided to his family while writing to a friend, "What an unattractive person La Sand is. Is she really a woman?" A few months later, Chopin and Sand were lovers for 9 years. In the first half of the 19th century, a woman who is an author, that is to say, who claims authority, can't be a real woman. In France, Germaine de Staël, Georges Sand, and Marie Dagout, Franz Liszt lover, embody glorious exceptions, while in England, Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot, among many others, gain respectability. But when it comes to female composers, the situation is uniformly worse everywhere in Europe. Fanny Mendelssohn learned it at her expense, although she was given more or less the same musical education as her brother Felix, and showed similar promise. She was warned by her father Abraham on her 23rd birthday, "Become more steady and collected, and prepare more earnestly and eagerly for your real calling, the only calling of a young woman, I mean the state of a housewife." Fanny did get married the year after, but remained musically active. She introduced the young Charles Gounod to Bach's keyboard music, performed and composed. Nevertheless, it was only in 1846 that she ventured to publish anything, a collection of Lieder, a form she especially cherished. But on May 14, 1847, a day after completing her final Lied, she died from a stroke, cutting short a career that could have been truly exceptional. She was 41. Her brother, in despair, wrote his string quartet in F minor, also known as Requiem for Fanny. He died less than 6 months after his sister, after a series of strokes, a family condition that had already killed their parents and their grandfather. Felix was 38. Entitled Bergeslust, or Mountain Pleasure, the last Lied Fanny wrote was found on her desk the day she died. I have no doubt that you're going to enjoy the great energy contained in its music and lyrics, conveyed by Rosalind Wong at the piano and the wonderful voice of Daniel Palomares.
Weit über Wald und Strom, hoch über sich den blauen
wish was to be recognized as a composer. Jacques Offenbach was to be recognized as a serious one. Although he achieved in his youth international fame as a cellist and enjoyed a tremendous success during his lifetime with his operettas, his secret dream was to write a real opera. A first attempt, Die Reinigsen, was a flop. The Tales of Hoffmann, undertaken in his final years, would almost fulfill his hopes. Almost, because Offenbach died before achieving its complete orchestration. The composer, who is reputed to have said, "I would give everything I have to be at the premiere," never saw his masterpiece represented, at least on stage. An abridged version was given at the composer's house a few months before his death. Obituary notices in 1880, mostly from critics dubbed Musical Snobs Limited by historian Peter Gammond, scoffed at Offenbach's frivolous and light music, soon to be forgotten. Not only has this judgment proved to be false, but the Tales of Hoffmann had quickly reversed it. Along with his greatest hits like La Belle Hélène, La Péricole, La Vie Parisienne, La Grande Duchesse de Gerolstein, Offenbach's most serious opera is regularly performed around the world. All the amateurs know about one of its famous arias called Les Oiseaux dans la Charmille, literally the birds in the arbor, known in English as the Doll's Song. It is part of the first act, the only one Offenbach had the time to revise. The plot, inspired by The Sandman, written by E.T.A. Hoffmann, tells the story of a man in love with an automaton, and the automaton can sing. Swan song is a very attractive idea, a beautiful metaphor, the flash of beauty, the sudden burst of modernity before the end, the overwhelming legacy. But is it a relevant and applicable concept? In other words, is any swan song theory conceivable? Let's return briefly to our examples. Schubert's late style actually proved to be a climax of his artistic development, interrupted too soon. Chopin's late style was nothing but his new style developed over several years. Fanny Mendelssohn's and Jacques Offenbach's lives were cut short by death as they tried to reorient their very diverse careers. None of them offered consistent examples of any consistent system or model defining swan song or late style. Late style is not last style. Late style is not systematic. Late style is rare. It doesn't have to do necessarily with the time of death, but with the feeling of finiteness. Arthur Rimbaud sang his swan song at 17. His style was from the beginning a late style. By that I mean, late style is the point of maturity you reach when you don't have anything to do with life anymore, no more attachment or involvement of any kind. Not only are you detached, but your work gains some kind of autonomy impossible to attain otherwise. Late style as an attempt to reach self-transcendence is a romantic concept in the strongest sense of the term. As Walter Benjamin wrote, only since Romanticism has the following view become predominant, that the work of art in and of itself, and without reference to theory or morality, can be understood in contemplation alone and that the person contemplating it can do it justice. The relative autonomy of the work of art vis-à-vis art, or better, its exclusively transcendental dependence on art, has become the prerequisite of romantic art criticism. End of quote. As intransitive form, the work of art doesn't refer anymore to any religious, moral, political, or even aesthetic program. It refers only to itself. Late style is characterized by a real disturbance, something dark and creaking, profoundly unusual, profoundly autonomous. This principle can be extended, for instance, to Goya. The parallel between Beethoven and Goya, who died within 1 year of each other, has been made for a long time. Both are regarded as the last old masters and the first of the moderns of the Romantic era. Both experienced deafness and seclusion. Beethoven and Goya share many political interests in the French Revolution, or the figure of Napoleon, for instance, and artistic outpourings. Like Beethoven's last quartets or Missa Solemnis, Goya's Black Paintings, a series of 14 phantasmagorical dark scenes decorating his home, La Quinta del Sordo, Deaf Man's Villa, have long constituted an enigma. Incoherence and fragmentation, solitude and devastation, chaos and formlessness. The unintelligible black paintings disseminate a sense of dissonance. That is probably the closest definition of late style or swan song I can come up with. Disharmony. Disharmony as the essence of art, as the core of life. It is probably because such an idea is quite unbearable that our minds try at all costs to create an artificial and retroactive genealogy, such as Turner is announcing abstract expressionism, Schoenberg is already in Beethoven, or Goya foreshadows surrealism. Late style actually forces us to think out of the box, that is to say, out of chronology, but also of temporality. When I visited the Turner exhibition, I was struck, if not overwhelmed, by the fact that Turner is not talking about time nor even space, but about energy. Not that energy is not a historical category, but the way he's transmitting it is nothing but a raw sentiment of vitality. In fact, late style leaves us without explanation other than our own experience of the human condition. One of my favorite quotations ever is a sentence of the French Fluxus artist and action poet, Robert Filiou. Art is what makes life more interesting than art. When I first heard the sentence, I said, could you repeat? Not that I'm suggesting that you're as slow as I am, but I'm repeating it. Art is what makes life more interesting than art. I guess the difficult concept of swan song is a perfect illustration of that motto. I would need many more lecture concerts to develop the topic of the swan song that inspired so many poets, from Chaucer to Tennyson, from Baudelaire to Mallarmé, not to forget Coleridge, who deserves our respect, if only for these two verses. Swans sing before they die, to have no bad thing should certain persons die before they sing. But our time is limited, and as a farewell to the swan song, Guillaume and I thought there would not be a better combination than a performance played and choreographed of Saint-Saëns' The Swan from the Carnival of the Animals, with Rosalind at the piano, Hilary at the cello, and dancer Elizabeth del Rosario. Thank you very much. That's all.